Welcome to GLOBEWATCH with me, Charles Ibune, at inside the Canadian High Commission here in Yaoundé, Cameroon, a constitutional democratic federal monarchy with plus 34 million people, with at least 90% of the individuals living within 200 kilometers of its borders with the United States of America, a country she shares a daily trade flow of at least $2 billion. Canada is the second largest country in the world in terms of surface area after Russia, making it one of the key players of contemporary global politics. Canada's Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, has outlined a new foreign policy orientation based on three key principles, as announced to its international partners by the country's ministers of foreign affairs, trade, and defense. What is new, and why should it be of concern to an ordinary global citizen? Rene Cremonese, welcome to GLOBEWATCH.
Oh, thank you very much for inviting me today.
With me is a speech by your foreign minister, Chrystia Freeland, delivered on June 6 in the House of Commons, and which simply says that Canada needs to set up in the world. What does that mean?
Well, I think you'll find that Minister Freeland's speech was part of a week of announcements of importance on foreign policy. So there was her speech in the House of Commons, followed by a defense review by Minister Harjit Sajjan, followed by a speech from Minister Bibo on the issue of new development assistance directions. So I think the underlying principle to take away is that Canada has a role to play in the world, and we're looking to step up to do that.
The speech I have is about 4,117 words with three key cardinal points: security, climate change, and global cooperation, if you like, international development. Why are you insisting on them now?
I think what the message that we've got from the Minister and from the Prime Minister over the last couple of years is the importance that in dealing with world crises, world imperatives, those could be issues such as countering terrorism here in Cameroon, like Boko Haram or Daesh in the Middle East. It could be issues relating to crimes against humanity, climate change. These are areas which face all countries and where we need to cooperate and work together. And the importance is for countries like Canada and also countries like Cameroon to do that in a situation where there are rules, and the rules are there to protect the small from the more powerful, to make sure we have a rules-based system that pushes us in the direction we want to go.
The United Nations Security Council and the UN body completely has agreed on a reduction of its spending budget of at least $7 billion worldwide because of the slashing by the Trump administration on its U.S. Contribution to the UN. When Foreign Minister Freeland says Canada needs to step up its global contribution, does Canada's change of strategy take into consideration the new world order in Washington?
Yeah, I think if you look at the speech again by the minister, you'll see that there is a significant portion devoted to the reasons why Canada feels it needs to step up its game. And one of the reasons is that in recognizing a solid partnership we've had with the United States over the past 50, 60 years, 70 in the creation of the New World Order since the Second World War, that America has been an essential country for all of us. There are portions of the US population that are clearly questioning that leadership role on from the United States. And if that's the case, it becomes all the more imperative for Canada to continue with an independent foreign policy and to do its part, which was why you'll see in the speech and the announcements, as I mentioned, an increase in military spending over the next 10 years.
How much do you spend today, and how much do you intend to inject in military spending?
I can't give you an exact figure as to what the budget for Canadian military defense spending is at the moment. What I would say is that within the context of NATO, there's been an aspiration among NATO members to try and spend 2% of their GDP.
Is the pressure from Donald Trump working now? Because it says if anybody doesn't meet the threshold fixed by NATO member countries, look, we will take out American troops out of it. Is it the pressure from Donald Trump working?
That is an aspirational commitment, one that was there as part of NATO well before the arrival of the current US administration, and one in which Canada said we would try to work towards that. I will say that the announcement of the defense minister was that there would be a 70% increase in our defense spending over the next 10 years.
Over the past months, Canada itself has been under attack from terrorists on homeland, and you are involved in an international coalition to outwin ISIS in Syria, in Iraq. With significant progress in the week from the Iraqi security forces. Can I have an idea of this new security global strategy from Canada? What makes it different from the previous one?
I think that what you're looking at is the commitment that's being made. So that the new strategy, we haven't reviewed our defense policy in almost a decade now. So there were massive consultations across Canada, academics, the general public, to try and to figure out what direction we wanted to go. And
do you think that it is a policy or a strategy which has holes, like the British one? Because if you take London in particular, it's the most cameras Soviet city in the world, at least statistics from MI6 and other British intelligence services say that at least 14 people per camera in London, but you see you still have attacks everywhere. Do you think that your own security strategy back home has holes?
Well, I don't think that any system in the world is perfect in terms of security. There'll always be a way for there to be weaknesses, but I think the most important thing is that the security apparatus in Canada, police, military, everyone who's involved, are looking at the new threats, looking at new situations that exist around the world, and they're taking the appropriate steps to make sure that we can protect the Canadian population. For example, as you know, it is Canada's 150th birthday.
The statement from Foreign Minister, Defense Minister, and the Minister for International Cooperation came days after the Trump White House pulled the United States of America from the Paris climate change deal. The departure from the US will create at least $70 million vacuum yearly of the $100 billion expected to support developing countries withstand the shocks of climate change. Will you effectively fill American absence in this domain?
That's an interesting question, but I think the most important aspect for Canada is that no one country, even the United States, leaving the Paris Accord, has the ability to change the general direction of what is happening in the world. There are so many other countries and so much commitment to moving forward on climate change that we're going to continue in that direction.
How much of a threat is climate change, for example, to Canada itself before complaining about other countries in the world?
Well, you can look at Canada quite clearly, and any number of studies on the impact. You will find that the north of Canada will be perhaps most affected.
Just a minute. Yeah? Look at this picture here. This is a Canadian picture, right?
Yes.
Does this picture better tell the story of the climate change story in Canada, for example?
Oh, that's a typical Canadian winter scene. But exactly what you're saying, the far north is experiencing climate change and temperature increases to a more rapid and greater degree than latitudes farther south in Canada or near the equator. So we will be directly affected, and the way of life of our Inuit and Indigenous peoples in the far north will be seriously affected. We're looking at polar bears and how the change in temperature is affecting the way of life and potentially the survival of a species. So Canada, as we would say in English, has a lot of skin in the game. And so it's critical for us to take action and to be part of the solution. But before we move or leave on this, you asked again about the Trump administration. And one of the things that Canada is also looking to do is to find partners within the United States. So we have the province of Ontario, the province of British Columbia, working, for example, with California. There are Canadian cities working with US cities to exchange information, to exchange the ability of expertise to tackle climate change.
I have practically no lesson to lecture you that relations amongst states is among states and not with entities in that state. How effective will the new global climate change policy be with American cities? In Pittsburgh, I saw the mayor who got up one morning and said that President Donald Trump, I'm not with you. I saw the governor of California, whom you are talking about, New Mexico, of UN climate change special envoy, former New York City Mayor Michael Bloomberg, offering $15 million I beg your pardon, to fill the American gap. How effective will nations work with private entities or independent entities in the United States without the approval of the federal administration?
I think there's a lot of leeway for us to work. I think that you will also see that much of the action that's been effective in Canada to deal with climate change has come down as well from those lower levels. But the government, following on the Paris Agreement, convened all the provinces and territories in Canada, and we established for the first time a national price on carbon, and those provinces signed on. So we have a national strategy, and it's at that local level that the change will actually be affected. At the national level, you can make all kinds of undertakings, but it really is on the ground where those changes are going to take place. You also talked about filling a gap for developing countries, because it's very important, one of the elements of the accord in Paris. And at the time, Canada announced that it was putting aside $2.6 billion for climate adaptation for developing countries. And now that we've gone through the international assistance review, climate change was made as to one of the 4 pillars of work we're trying to do on our international assistance strategy, and that fund and its use will be front and center in our response.
You just talked about developing countries and the climate change dilemma or debacle, and that takes me to a question which has to do with your new international development policy. Where are the key priority areas?
I think it's pretty simple. I had a briefing with a number of other heads of mission a while ago from our Minister of International Development, the Honorable Merkel. And I think it was a pretty simple message to us. Women and girls, women and girls, women and girls. The idea is that Canadian development assistance policy is a feminist development assistance policy, that women and girls are primary agents of change in their societies, and every element of Canadian development assistance will have to take into account, either target women and girls directly or make sure that they are an essential element of the programming and the work we're going to do. So it's a critical element of the way forward.
Well, I understand that Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is so much passionate about the empowerment of women worldwide. But let me just, with me, it's a map of Canada's overseas financial assistance package. In sub-Saharan Africa, for example, a country like Ethiopia, you provide some 193.7 million of Canadian dollars. Tanzania 174.3, this is from the Canadian International Development Agency, the statistics I'm reading to you. And in a country like Mali, it's $152 million. Are you going to increase that?
At the moment?
What is the new package?
The package is sitting still at about 3.9 billion Canadian. That's our international assistance envelope. And further considerations as to increases to that amount of money are coming from the government. After the review, they indicated they'd be looking in the next couple of years as to how much of an increase might occur. But that's really for the ministers and cabinet and the prime minister to decide. At the moment, it's quite clear the number has stayed the same.
Back in 2014, the Canadian government by then spent some $36 million of Canadian dollar in maternal health related issues. Yes. You have been here for some time. You know how dire the humanitarian situation has been in the Lake Chad Basin area, where the UN refugee agency says that they need at least $241 million to sustain some 460,000 refugees emanating from the Boko Haram insurgency and the instability in the Central African Republic. How much lobby have you done to help solve that problem? You know, UNICEF says at least 50,000 children are suffering from malnutrition in the northern part of Nigeria.
Okay. Well, let's look at the experience here for Cameroon. When I arrived, Canada was providing $2.5 million for
Can we
humanitarian
tag
assistance.
that experience to the Boko Haram palaver in particular?
Sure. That $2.5 million was humanitarian assistance for two crises that Cameroon faces. One is the refugees internally displaced in the north of Cameroon, and also the impact that the Central African crisis had with the refugees in the east. The subsequent year, the number went up to 5 million, and this year the number is just over 7 million. Simultaneous to that, Canada was providing about $16 million a year for assistance in Central African Republic, and in the Lake Chad Basin, we've also, over that same period, increased our assistance for northern Nigeria, for Niger, and for Chad. We recognize that these are impacts that cannot be addressed by the countries themselves. I would also highlight that over the same time period, with respect to our cooperation on the security front in the battle against Boko Haram, we've also stepped up our game. So we are now on the verge of providing equipment to the special forces of the Gendarmerie. We have provided funding for training with respect to how to build terrorism cases, other training in intelligence gathering methodologies. So we've put together a package, and that is to provide direct support, because we recognize, as I said earlier and from the minister's speech, that these are global imperatives. These are challenges facing us all, and we need to work together to solve them.
A chunk of the money you are talking about and your new global foreign policy priorities will be based on humanitarian work and the refugee crisis in particular. And I understand that during the campaign period that brought him to power, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau promised to spend some $100 million of Canadian dollars to support some 25,000 refugees from Syria, whom, of course, the Americans under the Trump administration are sending away if you look at the new travel ban. And at the end of the day, the government has spent at least $383 million. Why is Canada so much interested in the refugee crisis today?
Well, I think it's an issue, as I said, that goes back to that basic principle. There are challenges that face us all, and we have to work together. If you want to have a world order that allows for growing prosperity for everyone on the planet, if it allows for peace and security to be possible, you have to try and address and deal with these crises which exist and which countries on their own can't solve. So you mentioned the election campaign. The Prime Minister, during the campaign, promised that we would bring in 25,000 Syrian refugees, resettle them to Canada. Between October, when they were elected, and the end of February, they met that goal. And last year, in total, we helped to resettle some 40,000 Syrian refugees in Canada. And we continue work to do that. I think one thing that's quite fascinating to me about that entire story is that Canada has a unique system for resettling refugees, is that we have government-sponsored refugees and we have a private system. So any group of people can get together and tell the government, we have the money and we have the resources to sponsor refugees. And the government then vets them for security and other aspects, and those people take up the cause. So all across Canada, hundreds of thousands of Canadians have banded together to welcome those Syrian refugees and to welcome other refugees around the world.
Well,
and this, hold on a second. And this is
a very thorny issue. You know how polarizing it is in Germany today. You know how polarizing it is in the United States of America. You know how it is polarizing in France. I just wonder whether you foresee the political backlash of all of this in the next general elections. In most countries around the world now, people are not all that welcoming to refugees. I just doubt the generosity of the Canadian government.
Well, let me go back to what I was going to say. 1986, for example, the country of Canada was recognized by the UN High Commission for Refugees with the Nansen Award, the only time a country has been recognized. And that was for our response at the time to the Vietnamese boat people. When you look at opinion polls in Canada right now about the importance of diversity, multiculturalism, accepting immigrants and refugees, you will find that the levels of support for that are higher in Canada than virtually any other country. Germany and Sweden, their numbers, despite the migration that has occurred and the pressures, they still have high levels of acceptance. Canada has a history of accepting immigrants and of welcoming them. We also have a history of that type of populism, that type of racism that you might have seen early in our history, but I think that you will see in the current population of Canadians that there is a welcomeness and an openness to helping those who need our assistance.
You will be leaving Cameroon very soon. Probably you came here at the middle of a crisis, the Boko Haram insurgency, and probably you are living in the middle of a crisis, basically because of the dire security situation in the northwest and southwest regions of Cameroon, principally dominated by the English-speaking community. The situation there is not quite different from the Canadian experience with les Québécois il y a les années. Where do you think both parties went wrong based on the Canadian experience?
Well, you started out with a reference, though, to the Boko Haram crisis. So let me start with that. I think clearly there has been progress with respect to Boko Haram, and things are headed in the right direction. And we're pleased that we are now and have been able to play a part, both for refugees and, as I said earlier, in looking at the security element. It remains a complex issue, and I hope that the trend lines will continue to be positive so that the people in that region can get back to living their lives and to moving forward. Because one thing that has clearly impressed me is the resilience of that population to the many atrocities, the attacks, and the displacement of their way of life. So that would be a first comment. With respect to the Anglophone issue, certainly it's a challenge that Canada faced. They're not identical, but there are certainly similarities. And what I can say is that Canada probably has experience here from what we went through that we might be able to share with Cameroon that could help in moving things forward. I noticed, for example, that the government here has announced that it will have a common law portion or section within the Supreme Court. Canadian practice for many years, because we're a mirror image, has been that 3 positions on our Supreme Court are dedicated to people who have come up with the civil code experience out of the province of Quebec. So we've got an experience with that. We can tell you how that has worked within our Supreme Court, and you can take that experience and apply it to the project that you've got ongoing. I think that's where people approach me looking for information and advice, including from members of the new Commission on Bilingualism and Multiculturalism here, and we're happy to try and provide any information we can.
Monsieur le Haut-Commissaire, permettez-moi de vous poser une question en français avant de se séparer parce que c'est la culture du gouvernement canadien que les diplomates s'expriment dans les 2 langues officielles que compte le pays, le français et l'anglais. Et je voudrais savoir quelle est votre prochaine destination après le Cameroun?
Là, je voulais bien vous dire où va être la prochaine affectation, mais comme on n'a pas encore eu agrément de l'autre pays, et comme le gouverneur général, notre chef de l'État, n'a pas signé mes lettres de créance, je ne suis pas dans la mesure de vous dire où va être mon prochaine affectation.
The outgoing Canadian High Commissioner to Cameroon, Rene Cremonese, thank you very much for being guest on GlobeWatch.
Thank you very much for having me.
You're welcome.